Hello everyone, welcome back to Road to Damascus. Today I want to look at a very important question in religion. Does God have a creator? Now, to answer this, I want to first give a disclaimer that this is going to be a very technical submission, but I'm going to do my best to explain the concepts as simply as I can. Now back to the question. Does God have a creator? Now, to answer this, I think most people that ask this question start off on a wrong premise. Their premise goes like this. If everything that exists has a cause, and we say God exists, then God must also have a cause. And God, that means God has a creator. And whoever created God must also have a creator. Now, I think that is a wrong interpretation of the Kalam cosmological argument. Because the Kalam cosmological argument does not stipulate that if something exists, then it must have a cause. Actually, what it says is that if something begins or began to exist, then it must have a cause. So if you have an entity or a system that never began to exist, then nothing necessarily must not have a cause, or necessarily should not necessarily have a cause, or could exist without a cause. Let me put it that way. So if we can prove that it's plausible that God exists, but God has always existed, right? And God never began to exist, then we can say God exists, but not necessarily God has a cause, and then God does not need to have a creator. Now, to address this, we have to get back to the concept of infinities. If you remember one of my earlier submissions, I said infinities by themselves are not compatible with a physical reality. That is to say that we went through the analogy that some infinities can be bigger than other infinities, but then that is a contradiction because all infinities are infinitely large, and having other infinities bigger than other infinities does not necessarily make sense physically, and they would not exist in a physical system. But if you have a system that is not physical, or that is not constrained by the rules of a physical system, then that deity or that entity can be compatible with an infinity. So here's an example. God exists outside of a physical manifestation, right? We know this because if God created the universe, then God has the power to cause the physical system into being in the first place. And God must necessarily be outside that physical system to be able to do that. So we know that God is outside the physical reality. And that sort of presupposes that he is not constrained by the limitations of the physical system. But the system itself that has been created, the physical system, which is the universe, is constrained by the limitations of the physical system. So even though the universe is not compatible with an infinity, God that is outside the physical reality may be compatible with an infinity, meaning God can have an infinite past. So he could be eternal, meaning God has always existed in the capacity that we have him. So if God has always existed, then God necessarily doesn't need to have a creator. So the idea of an infinite regression does not hold if God is assessed as some entity that is outside the physical reality. Then God necessarily can be compatible with an infinity, and God can have an eternal past or an infinite past. And so God necessarily must not have a creator, or can exist without a creator, even though he exists. So even though this is a very technical analysis, it's very simple. The idea of God existing without a creator follows this train of thought. God exists eternally in the past because God is outside the physical system, so God is not constrained by the limitations of the physical system. The physical system has a limitation that it is not compatible with an infinity, but God, since he's outside the frame of the physical reality, can be compatible with an infinity, and so God can have an eternal past, meaning God can exist without a creator. And that is how, as a Christian, you can sort of suggest to somebody that says, if your God exists, then it means your God has a creator. You can say God exists, but God exists without a creator because God never began to exist. God has an eternal past. Thank you. If this content appeals to you, please like and subscribe and follow for more content like this.